How's it going, guys? Chris here. Today I'm going to be talking about the new Call of Duty game, Modern Warfare, because over the last weekend I managed to sink quite a few hours into the 2v2 Gunfight alpha on the PS4, allowing me to get the general gist of the game's gunplay, sound, graphics and the new game mode itself, along with a few other things too. Obviously I can't really talk in great detail about everything in Modern Warfare's multiplayer, because we only got to play a snippet of what the whole game offers, so I can't really comment on kill streaks, weapon customization and all of that sort of stuff. But I can definitely give my opinions on the general gameplay on trial during the alpha, which I'll be running over in this video. Think of it as a bit of an early review on what I got to try out. There's been a hell of a lot of hype surrounding Modern Warfare lately, and although it's something I've been pretty eager to play myself, I need to evaluate everything with an unbiased mind, not taking this hype into account. The gunfight mode probably isn't the best way to let people evaluate the game's mechanics and stuff, mainly because it's a very competitive mode that doesn't really let you play around and adjust to said mechanics as easily as if you were thrown into something like Team Deathmatch, with it having respawns and more customization options. But I guess Infinity Ward have chosen Gunfight for the alpha to show it off, because it's something new, and because it'll probably be easier to test, with matches having very low player counts, which kinda makes sense. Before I talk in more detail about the gameplay, I might as well highlight the new Gunfight game mode first, and give you my general opinions on that. In case you know nothing about this, it's a pretty competitive game mode that supports up to 4 players, but in 2v2 on some very small maps, which follow a similar sort of free lane pattern that COD maps have done in the past, only with the lanes being a bit more open. The aim of the game is to kill the other 2 guys on the opposing team before they kill you, or capture the flag in the middle of the map, which appears after a certain amount of time. If the clock runs out, and there's still players active on both teams, the team with the most amount of health wins that round. There's no respawns until you come back into the next round, and loadouts and weapons change to spice things up a bit as rounds progress. The first team to win 6 rounds will be victorious, and that's generally most of the main things there is to know about Gunfight. It's a pretty simple mode to wrap your head around, though despite being very straightforward, it can still offer a very tense experience that's sure to get your heart going, especially if your teammate's gone down and it's up to you to win the round. It kind of felt like a small scale version of Search and Destroy, in the sense that once you're down, you're out. And because of the fact that you could win the round by capturing an objective, which may or may not be overlooked by the enemy, waiting to gun you down and using it as a bit of a trap. So this added more of a risk-reward element that also forced players to move around the map and not camp as much as they'd probably like to. Considering there's no respawning though, because of the low player count, it never really felt like you were out of the fight for too long, as rounds were usually over fairly quickly, and this kept the action flowing quite nicely. Despite the maps being very small and mainly centered around close quarter combat, they did offer a range of sightlines to cater for different weapons and playstyles, opening up a variety of ways matches could be played out. So for instance, you could choose to be a bit more defensive and hang around your spawn, scanning the map for a potential victim, or you could do the complete opposite and rush around the side of the map to try and flank your enemies. The fact that teams consisted of 2 players also give you the choice to buddy up and follow each other, or separate and create diversions away from your teammate while the other flanked around one of the sides. So if you're playing with a friend and chatting with each other on mics, you can actually use some tactics and work together to get the drop on your enemies, if you're smart enough. Now, I'm not really a massive fan of super competitive modes in games, so Gunfight probably won't be my game mode of choice when Modern Warfare launches and everyone's playing it. But it's definitely an interesting mode if you do feel like testing yourself against other players and fancy hopping into something a bit different. I can imagine Gunfight being a hell of a lot of fun with a few friends, playing with and against each other in private lobbies too. Knowing my set of mates, we'll probably end up turning it into a drinking game. But I do have to say that Gunfight did feel a bit samey after a bunch of rounds, and it's not something I can personally see myself playing over and over again, especially if I'm on my own, buddied up with a complete random. But maybe in between matches on some of the bigger modes that support more players, as a bit of a supplement to mix things up every now and then. It wasn't perfect, as there was a few times where players backed out, turning it into a 2v1 battle, which didn't exactly make things very fair. And there are also a few times where a player would just be inactive, probably because they've gone to the bathroom or something without realising they were still in matchmaking after a game would finish, also pretty much turning things into a 2v1 situation as well. But nevertheless, it's definitely a mode worth checking out, especially if you've got a mate that you can team up with, which will more often than not give you a nice advantage over a couple of lone wolves. Anyway, moving away from the gunfight mode and talking a little bit more about the game's mechanics and stuff themselves. One thing I was particularly impressed with, something I don't normally praise all that much in games, was the sound design, which was really bloody good. It's not something that typically tends to spring to mind straight away, but it did, pretty much from the first match in Modern Warfare. It's not very often I get excited about a gun's magazine snapping its way into the receiver, or a sniper rifle's bolt being cycled, or empty cartridges jingling around on the floor. But the realistic sounds really made the whole experience not just more immersive, but really gratifying too. Let's just say that the weapons don't sound like little plastic toys anymore, and that's something I can really appreciate. The weapons sound brutal and meaty when you fire them, bullets punch their way through their victims, explosive and stun grenades sound bassy and deadly, and altogether it just makes the game feel much more alive. I can only imagine what it's going to be like in some of the beefier game modes with lots of players and action going on all over the place, as the sound will probably put you right in the middle of the war zone, adding to the overall experience. Another thing I should probably talk about is the graphics and animations, which I'm just going to skim over because you can pretty much see what it's like from the footage playing in the background. As you'll probably notice, it's all looking a bit better than what we've been used to in some of the past titles. And that's because Modern Warfare is the first COD game in 14 years to run on a brand new engine. Pretty much all of the other ones since Call of Duty 2 from 2005 have used the same core engine, which have been slightly tweaked and modified over the years to essentially help to upgrade the graphics and get with the times. The brand new engine being used in Modern Warfare is quite obviously a big step up from this, and gives us some much more realistic lighting, shadows and textures, all making the game's environments and models look a lot more lifelike. Not to mention that player visibility also seemed to be very clear, which is more than I can say for another particular shooter game that I've been covering on my channel very recently. Animations also run very smoothly, and transitions between said animations help to make everything flow together quite well, keeping you engaged with what's happening on screen without breaking any immersion. And basically, long story short, Modern Warfare's visuals are looking really good. As someone who's played the majority of COD games since the original Modern Warfare from 2007, it's quite clear to me that there's a lot of new tech being used here. I found that the heads-up display looked really crisp and clear to see without it obstructing too much of the action on the screen, and the menus all seem to be quite slick and easy on the eye too, which is all well and good. So far in this video, everything seems to be going quite well for Modern Warfare. But it's time for me to address one pretty big issue that probably quite a lot of other people haven't really been talking about all that much, and that's down to the lack of controls customization in the settings on console. Now, it was only an alpha and an early build of the game, so these issues might get addressed and things might still be added for the final product. But I couldn't help but notice that Modern Warfare was missing quite a few settings that are pretty standard for a lot of shooter games by this day and age. Probably the biggest setting here that I'm referring to is Thumbstick Dead Zone, which basically allows you to customize how responsive the thumbsticks are. There's just so many games out nowadays that support Dead Zone settings on console, like Battlefield, Rainbow Six Siege, PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, GTA, Star Wars Battlefront, Fortnite, Overwatch, Apex Legends, you get the picture. But Call of Duty has always been one of those games that's just stubbornly stuck with having bog standard sensitivity settings, and pretty much nothing else. As someone who's gotten very used to playing with low dead zone settings on practically every other game recently, I found that aiming and traversal in Modern Warfare was often a bit stickier and less responsive than normal, which quite often affected the gameplay, mainly because of those larger dead zones. I think it's about time Call of Duty evolved into the present day and actually give players the options to tweak their settings more, which will generally lead to a better, more responsive experience, like most of the games do, especially with COD being the competitive shooter that it is. A dead zone setting wasn't the only thing missing, because a field of view slider also wouldn't have gone amiss either. PC players have the option, so I think it's only fair that console players should have it too, especially with the game going cross-platform. Though there might be some hardware limitations preventing the devs from adding an FOV slider to console, which would make sense why they haven't done it so far. It also would have been quite nice to tweak ADS sensitivity too, as opposed to just having one setting that ruled them all. But I guess that just might be me being spoilt by other games having these sort of advanced options. All we really got on the alpha was a standard sensitivity scale and a few things to tweak the game's aim assist. But perhaps if we were given a few more controller settings, people probably wouldn't have to rely on aim assist quite as much to get the job done. Just my 2 cents. Fingers crossed that some of the devs might pick up on these requests and implement them into the final build, because I know for a fact that I'm not the only guy that really wants stuff like dead zone settings in the game. Apart from this though, the actual gameplay itself was pretty good. Not quite as fast paced as a few of the older titles, but that may have been down to the gunfight game mode that we were testing, promoting more of a strategic, slower tempo. Weapons felt like they had relevant sort of weight behind them, adding to the realism and giving them different properties to make them feel varied. And overall, it's still a fairly arcadey experience, but probably a bit less so than in past games, down to the pacing of the gameplay, and down to the way that guns functioned, having stuff like bullet drop and travel time, rather than being hit scan. Which isn't really all that noticeable in close quarter combat environments anyway, if I'm going to be honest. But it's still a thing nevertheless. So summarising my experience with Modern Warfare's alpha, it's pretty much exactly how I expected it was going to be after watching some reveal footage and hearing about all the news up to this point. Which really isn't a bad thing. It's shaping up to be a very slick game that goes back to those slightly more serious, grittier tones that made COD so bloody popular in the first place. So basically going back to the things that made me want to play the game many years ago. The alpha was a lot of fun, despite it being centred around a very competitive mode which isn't normally my cup of tea. Though it allowed me to clearly see how Infinity Ward is advancing the franchise forwards and giving a big portion of the COD community what it really wants. With Modern Warfare's alpha delivering more impressive immersive graphics, sound design and gameplay elements that's sure to put a big smile on a lot of people's faces. You've got to remember that this was only a very small slither of the game's multiplayer, but I can say that I'm pretty happy with what I've seen and played so far. Not a completely flawless experience, with a few hiccups regarding the lack of controller options, but it was only an alpha at the end of the day, so I guess more things could still potentially be added to the final build. Hopefully so. But for now, that's basically everything I can really say at the moment. I'm going to be talking more about Modern Warfare in the future, so stick around and subscribe if you want to stay updated with new content. And give me a like on the way out to show your support. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll be seeing you in that next episode.